In the closing months of the Second World War, Europe was a graveyard of secrets. Files were burned, witnesses executed, and entire operations erased from record. But history has a way of bleeding through its own cover stories. From the shattered archives of Berlin to sealed NATO vaults buried beneath Brussels, fragments have surfaced, scraps of reports, intercepted cables, forgotten mission logs. They point to something deeper than victory or defeat. A hidden war fought in silence, between men who understood that truth itself was the final weapon. These are the recovered files, the stories that were never meant to be told. Chapter 1. The Vanished Convoy of Operation Solstice. At dawn on February 14, 1945, under a grey sky heavy with sleet, a column of German military trucks rolled out of Stettin. Official manifests, later found in fragmentary Wehrmacht records, identified it as a standard medical resupply operation. Morphine, surgical instruments, rations for the collapsing Eastern Front. Yet, the convoy's escort told another story. Each vehicle bore SS markings, its drivers from Kammler's construction brigade, the same unit responsible for the V2 complexes at Mittelwerk and the underground fortifications of Project Ries. The operation's codename was handwritten in faded red ink on a single surviving dispatch slip, Unternehmen Sonnenwende, Operation Solstice. The convoy was last seen by a Luftwaffe reconnaissance detachment near Schneidermühl, moving west under heavy snow cover. Allied decrypts from Bletchley Park intercepted radio chatter that referenced Package A9, an item prioritized for protection at all costs. According to decoded fragments, Kammler himself had authorized its transport. What A9 referred to has never been conclusively determined. Some post-war intelligence officers believed it to be a prototype warhead, others an archive of high-value research files. Whatever it was, the convoy never reached its destination. By February 17th, the Red Army's first Belarusian front had overrun the area. Soviet field engineers reported finding the charred remains of several trucks near a bridge outside Kustrin, their contents completely destroyed. But 2 vehicles, including the lead command truck, were missing. 3 days later, a German prisoner identified as Oberfeldwebel Ernst Bremer was interrogated at a Soviet forward position near Kostosin. In the transcript, still preserved in the GAF archives in Moscow, Bremer stated that the cargo was moved into the woods under order from Group 9. The last thing I heard before the shelling began was Kammler's voice on the field radio, telling us the packages were to be buried until further notice. Hours later, Bremer was executed by firing squad. When American OSS agents reviewed captured German documents after the war, the name Operation Solstice appeared again, attached to a cipher folder labeled Arne-Nürbe Logistics Division. Inside were inventories listing uranium oxide, vacuum tubes and gyroscopic guidance instruments, items consistent with experimental propulsion research. The British Air Ministry quietly requested copies of the material. Weeks later, all documents were reclassified by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, and transferred to US custody under the early framework of Operation Paperclip. The file references abruptly end in 1946. In 1948, a man calling himself Dr. Werner Albrecht resurfaced in Hamburg claiming to have driven in that convoy. He was interviewed by a US counterintelligence agent, Major Frank D. Keller. The recording of their conversation was marked eyes only and never officially released, but a partial transcript was leaked decades later. Albrecht stated that before the convoy's disappearance, a sealed steel crate, one of several, was loaded onto a flatbed rail car marked with a black double eagle seal. When Keller asked what was inside, Albrecht reportedly whispered, "It wasn't weapons, it was documents, sealed Reich files with foreign signatures." 3 days after the interview, Albrecht vanished. His apartment was found ransacked, his passport missing, and Keller's report was withdrawn from circulation. Throughout the 1950s, Western intelligence agencies periodically revisited the Solstice case. A classified memorandum from the Bundesnachrichtendienst, BND, dated 1957, refers to a residual cache buried near an abandoned railway spur outside Zielona Góra. Excavations were ordered, but cancelled when Soviet forces reoccupied the region. Decades later, in 1983, a Polish forestry team unearthed fragments of corrugated steel and rusted containers near the same coordinates. Inside one of the containers were burned paper scraps, the only legible text reading, Einsatzgruppe IK sicherstellen A9 Kammler. Persönlich. Historians later confirmed that, Handwriting matched that of an SS adjutant attached to Kammler's staff in 1940. Kammler himself, the architect of Nazi secret weapons programs, reportedly committed suicide in Prague on May 9, 1945. Yet no body was ever recovered, and conflicting testimonies placed him alive in US custody weeks later. The disappearance of the Solstice convoy became part of a larger puzzle surrounding Kammler's post-war fate and the hidden transfer of advanced German research into Allied hands. One declassified CIA briefing from 1961 notes, assets connected to Operation Solstice show continuity with post-war propulsion projects under DoD contract. No further elaboration followed. In 1972, a retired Soviet colonel named Yuri Vasilev published memoirs describing his participation in an unofficial recovery operation near Kostrin in 1945. His account, quickly suppressed, claimed that his unit recovered sealed metal crates emitting low radiation signatures, and that a senior officer from Moscow immediately classified the site. Vasilev wrote they were not looking for weapons, they were searching for the paper inside. The book was withdrawn from circulation within a week. Today, Operation Solstice remains one of the most enduring enigmas of the final months of the war. Historians who have attempted to trace its trail encounter nothing but closed archives and missing logs. The Bundesarchive lists the Solstice file as lost or destroyed. 1945. American records reference the codename only once, buried in a 1949 memo under the notation recovered, disposition, unknown. Soviet archives remain sealed. The last tangible trace of the operation emerged in 1994 when a Polish historian, Dr. Tomasz Lelek, discovered a sealed lead cylinder during excavation work near the former rail line at Gorzów Wielkopolski. Inside were fragments of photographic film, partially degraded but still visible. The images showed uniformed men loading unmarked crates into trucks under winter conditions. One vehicle bore the unmistakable stencil A9. The negative was authenticated and dated to early 1945. 2 weeks later, Dr. Lelek's laboratory was burglarized and the negatives were stolen. Only photocopies remain. If Operation Solstice was indeed a simple supply mission, it would have been forgotten among the thousands of similar convoys lost in the chaos of the Eastern Front. Yet, the pattern of suppression, the repeated disappearances, and the unbroken silence in official records point to something larger. An operation shielded by layers of post-war secrecy that transcended national lines. Whether the convoy carried experimental technology, classified archives, or something even more destabilizing to the post-war order, no one has ever produced definitive proof. What remains are fragments, charred papers, vanished witnesses, erased correspondence. Somewhere in the forests east of Berlin, beneath decades of soil and silence, the path of Operation Solstice still lies buried. Every attempt to uncover it has met with the same quiet resistance. Files redacted, access denied, questions unanswered. History records the battles that were fought and the men who fought them. It rarely records what they were ordered to hide. Chapter 2. The Ghost Station Beneath Tempelhof. When the Red Army entered Berlin in May 1945, the ruins of the Reichstag and the Führerbunker drew the first wave of attention. But buried deeper, beneath the runways of Tempelhof Airport, Soviet engineers stumbled upon something that defied the logic of simple military infrastructure. Behind a wall of welded steel plates, placed hastily, almost as if to trap something inside, they found a sealed tunnel branching off from the disused U-Bahn line U6. The maps made no mention of it. Soviet Major Ivan Chernov, tasked with surveying the area, described it in his field report as a secondary tunnel showing signs of recent use, with power cables intact and air circulation maintained. That report, recovered from Russian archives decades later, was marked with the phrase, "Do not discuss beyond command." What the Soviets discovered in that tunnel has remained one of post-war Berlin's most persistent rumors. The sealed chambers, later nicknamed Station Adler, were filled with equipment the Red Army could not identify. Radio consoles, encryption tables, and racks of vacuum tube amplifiers still warm to the touch. Scattered across the floor were SS uniforms stripped of insignia, and on the wall, painted in crude black letters, a single phrase, Adler hört zu. The eagle listens. The Soviets dismantled part of the network, shipped what they could to Moscow, and blew the tunnel entrances shut. But the files describing what was found there, particularly the inventory lists, were sealed under a classification code used only for nuclear intelligence. No nuclear material was ever mentioned in the reports. When Berlin was divided, both American and British intelligence took an interest in the site. A 1949 G2 memo titled Subject: Unaccounted Radio Transmissions. Sector C noted sporadic bursts of encrypted radio activity detected on 8.42 MHz, always originating near the Tempelhof sector. The transmissions use cipher sequences resembling late-war SS codes, but modified with an extra layer of obfuscation. They would start precisely at 0300 hours and end within 5 minutes. Field teams sent to triangulate the source found nothing but empty tunnels and collapsed sections of track. British monitoring stations nicknamed the phantom signal Eagle Wave. It continued intermittently for 7 years. In 1953, amid the escalating Cold War, the CIA authorized a joint operation with West German intelligence, codenamed Operation Vertigo. Its objective was simple: locate the surviving transmitter of Station Adler and identify any individuals maintaining it. The operation's lead, CIA case officer Raymond Caldwell, established a covert base in the American sector, disguised as a communications repair unit. Over 6 months, Caldwell's team mapped sections of the old U-Bahn using ground-penetrating radar. They found evidence of recently disturbed soil beneath the south hangar of Tempelhof, suggesting an entrance had been reopened. When a 3-man recon team descended through the service shaft in October 1953, only 1 man returned. Sergeant William Lorne, the surviving member, was debriefed under sedation at Landstuhl Army Hospital. His testimony, preserved in a heavily redacted transcript, described a chamber lined with rusted electrical panels and a generator humming despite no visible power source. He claimed the air smelled like ozone and dust, and that voices could be heard echoing through the static of a nearby radio. The words were German, he said, but distorted, as if repeating phrases from old broadcasts. When asked if he saw any personnel, Lorne's response was chillingly specific. They were there, but not moving. Just sitting at the consoles, eyes open, uniforms rotted. The next morning, Lorne was found dead in his hospital room from what the coroner listed as self-inflicted trauma. The file was sealed. Operation Vertigo was quietly terminated that winter. Officially, the CIA cited inconclusive results and unsafe structural conditions. Unofficially, the West German Interior Ministry received an internal memorandum from US liaison Major Caldwell stating that the structure beneath Tempelhof represents a legacy network of unknown design and purpose, possibly intended for post-defeat communications continuity. He concluded with a single line: recommend permanent closure. In 1961, as the Berlin Wall rose, East German Stasi archives show renewed interest in the Tempelhof anomaly. A declassified HVA Directorate FAS report mentions a foreign-controlled signal source operating from abandoned infrastructure in the western sector. Attempts to trace the transmissions failed when East German technicians detected interference emanating from within their own signal monitoring equipment, a phenomenon they described as self-jamming. That same year, East German engineers attempting to dig a maintenance tunnel under the Landwehr Canal accidentally breached an old sealed passage. They reported finding graffiti that read, "Adler hört noch zu." The eagle still listens. Throughout the 1970s, urban explorers and Cold War historians began to speculate that Station Adler had been a contingency bunker for the SS Communications Corps, intended to coordinate resistance networks in the event of total defeat. Yet, none of the discovered equipment matched known German field radios or encryption devices. The closest analogues were American-made components manufactured in 1947, 2 years after the war's end. Some researchers have proposed that the tunnel was reactivated post-war by intelligence services seeking a deniable communication channel during the divided occupation. Others, citing the pattern of suppression surrounding every investigation, argue that both sides preferred to leave the mystery undisturbed. In 1998, a redevelopment project at Tempelhof uncovered a reinforced tunnel wall while installing new electrical conduits. Workers reported hearing faint tapping noises from behind the barrier, though acoustic analysis later dismissed it as vibration from machinery. Nonetheless, the city halted construction for 6 days while federal officials examined the site. The official statement claimed the tunnel was a relic of wartime shelter construction, yet eyewitnesses described men in unmarked, uniforms removing a large metallic crate from the excavation before sealing it again. The incident was not recorded in the municipal archives. The most recent mention of Station Adler came in a 2004 Freedom of Information request filed by German historian Karl Weissmann. The Bundesarchiv's response read simply, "No records on Tempelhof communications infrastructure are available for public release. Relevant material transferred to NATO archives, Brussels, 1968. When Weissmann attempted to access the NATO files, he was informed that they had been reclassified indefinitely due to national security considerations. For a facility that was never officially built, Station Adler has left an indelible trace on every intelligence agency that brushed against its shadow. Whether it was a wartime listening post, a Cold War relay, or something altogether stranger, a ghost network that refused to die, the fact remains. Radio operators continued to log unexplained transmissions near Tempelhof well into the 1980s. The signals bore a chilling signature, repeating one phrase in Morse every few years before falling silent again. The last transmission was recorded on December 12, 1989, 3 weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Its decoded message, received by a hobbyist operator in Tegel, read simply, "Adler hört zu." The eagle listens. Chapter 3. Project Harpocrates, the files that never existed. In the spring of 1946, with the Nuremberg trials drawing global attention, an unusual request reached the British Foreign Office. It came not from Germany, but from Luxembourg, a requisition order for teleprinters, microfilm cameras, and security safes. The request bore the signature of Colonel Richard L. Pembroke, attached to the Allied Field Coordination Unit, Luxembourg Sector. No such unit officially existed, yet funding was approved within hours, and the equipment quietly delivered to a requisitioned estate outside Ettelbruck, known locally as Chateau La Roche. The site would soon become the center of an operation so secret that even the agencies conducting it would later deny it ever happened. Its codename was Project Harpocrates. The premise of Harpocrates was simple but morally corrosive: to erase inconvenient truths before they reached the courtroom. Following Germany's surrender, both the OSS and the British SOE held archives filled with correspondence, contracts, and reports linking Allied corporations and intelligence officers to the Nazi industrial complex. American oil executives, British chemical companies, and neutral banking intermediaries had all, in one way or another, supported the Reich before the tide turned. If exposed, these connections could unravel the fragile alliance that was already fracturing into East and West. The order came from above: sanitize the record, control the narrative, and bury the evidence before the Soviets could weaponize it. According to declassified fragments of an MI6 logistics log from June 1946, the chateau housed 35 staff members drawn from British intelligence, OSS veterans, and select civilians under non-disclosure oath. The team was equipped with high-speed microfilm burners and acid dissolution vats. Each night, convoys of sealed crates arrived from various Allied archives, Nazi research ledgers, transport logs from the Reich Main Security Office, correspondence between IG Farben and Standard Oil. The crates were logged, photographed, and destroyed. The process was meticulous. Every document burned was replaced with a sanitized duplicate, preserving the official record but erasing the origin. The destroyed files were coded H-class, referencing the project's namesake, Harpocrates, the god of silence. Among the recovered fragments discovered decades later in a British MOD storeroom was a letter dated October 22, 1946, from Pembroke to a superior in London. It read, "We have completed destruction of 743 sets. Of note are the series from Nuremberg File Registry 12B, containing cross-reference data on subject companies with assets in New York and Rotterdam. Suggest continued discretion. The less remaining evidence, the cleaner the transition." The phrase, "cleaner the transition," became a darkened joke among the Harpocrates staff, shorthand for rewriting history, but silence breeds its own witnesses. In 1951, a journalist named Arthur Layton of the Manchester Gazette began tracing inconsistencies in the Nuremberg transcripts. His articles questioned why certain industrialists received light sentences or were quietly acquitted despite overwhelming evidence. He wrote of an invisible hand redacting the truth and cited an unnamed source inside the British archives. Layton's notes, recovered after his death, mention a codename, Harp, Lax 46. He believed it to refer to a post-war cleanup team. 3 months into his investigation, Layton's car veered off the Metz highway and exploded. French authorities ruled it an accident caused by fuel system failure. His widow received an anonymous envelope containing only a torn photograph of a chateau gate and a line of text, "Silence protects peace." After Layton's death, all references to Project Harpocrates disappeared from British records. Yet the Americans were not as thorough. In 1978, a Freedom of Information request unearthed an OSS after-action summary referring to Joint Anglo-American Custodial Operation, Luxembourg Sector, designated for archival reduction and witness management. The summary was unsigned, and every name was blacked out. A marginal note in pencil read, "Handled per instruction, Harp 2, Pembroke Liaison." The file was quickly reclassified. In 1989, a retired MI6 officer identified only as GH gave a private interview to a BBC researcher under condition of anonymity. The transcript, partially leaked in 2003, revealed disturbing specifics. GH claimed that among the destroyed archives were documents showing Allied procurement officers facilitating the transfer of Nazi patents on synthetic fuels and medical compounds to American corporations before the war's end. He also mentioned a list of 47 individuals scheduled for arrest by the OSS in 1945 who were quietly removed from all wanted registers after Harpocrates began. When asked what happened to Colonel Pembroke, GH replied, "He left Luxembourg in late 47. He was reassigned to Washington under a new name. They gave him a seat at the Reconstruction Conference in 49. The man who erased the records helped write the post-war narrative." A photograph discovered in the National Archives in Kew in 2010, marked Harpocrates Unit 1946, shows 7 men standing before a warehouse door, their insignia covered with tape. Behind them, faint lettering reads, "Number 12 Signals Depot." One of the men matches Pembroke's known description. The image is stamped "Withdrawn from circulation, 1954." On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "What was erased cannot remain buried." The only official acknowledgement of Harpocrates came indirectly in 1997, when declassified MI5 memoranda referenced post-trial sanitization measures undertaken by the Harpocrates Committee, Luxembourg, 1946 to 1947. The line was buried in a larger report concerning Cold War propaganda tactics. When questioned by historians, the Foreign Office denied any knowledge of the committee, calling it a misunderstanding arising from translation. Today, the chateau that housed Project Harpocrates is gone, demolished in 1962 after a fire of unknown origin. Local workers recall the military convoys that came during reconstruction, men in unmarked vehicles who removed soil samples and charred debris before the ruins were cleared. No human remains were ever reported, though residents spoke of sealed cellars beneath the estate that were never excavated. Historians still debate what Harpocrates truly accomplished. Some argue it was simply an archival purge, an administrative act meant to prevent Soviet exploitation of sensitive information. Others insist it went far deeper, reshaping the historical record to protect the reputations of those whose fortunes and influence built the post-war West. Whatever the truth, the project's legacy persists in the gaps, missing trial exhibits, contradictory testimonies, and corporate files whose absence is explained only by the phrase "destroyed during post-war reorganization." In one surviving memo, found misfiled in the private collection of a retired diplomat, a final directive closes the record. All Harpocrates materials to be sealed under new classification. If inquiry arises, deny existence. If exposure occurs, designate as myth. The memo is unsigned. Its date is March 17th, 1947. The ink has faded, but the last line remains legible, written in pencil beneath the official type. Still active. Chapter 4. The Baltic Anomaly and Operation SeaVane. On the evening of August 9th, 1959, a NATO hydroacoustic monitoring station on the island of Bornholm detected a sonar return unlike any previously recorded in the Baltic Sea. The object appeared to be metallic, roughly cylindrical, and situated 86 meters below the surface, approximately 40 nautical miles east of Gotland. Its outline was sharp against the seabed, a structured silhouette that did not resemble any known wreck. The station's commanding officer, Commander Henri Delmar, logged the reading under the entry "Unidentified Submersible Mass." Within 48 hours, the report reached SHAPE headquarters in Paris, and an urgent directive was issued to the Royal Swedish Navy under NATO liaison oversight. Initiate: Operation SeaVane. SeaVane's cover story described a routine bathymetric survey intended to chart seabed formations. In truth, the mission involved a mixed team of Swedish naval divers, US Navy intelligence officers, and British engineers from the Admiralty Underwater Research Establishment. Their orders were explicit: locate the anomaly, assess for technological or radiological hazard, and report findings directly to Allied command, bypassing local authorities. The Swedish minesweeper, HSWMS Sandon, departed Karlskrona on August 14th, carrying a contingent of 31 personnel and a mobile sonar array. Civilian maritime traffic was quietly diverted under the guise of hydrographic testing. By August 17th, divers had located the structure. It lay partially embedded in silt, its hull corroded but intact, marked with the faint traces of a German Kriegsmarine insignia, the eagle clutching a swastika, nearly erased by decades of salt water. The site was immediately sealed off. The divers described the object as a collapsed bunker or container, approximately 30 meters long, with reinforced ribs running along its side and an access hatch still visible. Inside, they recovered fragments of twisted machinery, lead-shielded pipes, copper conduits fused into slag, and the skeletal remains of a single man wearing remnants of a naval uniform. The uniform bore the insignia of the 33rd U-boat flotilla, disbanded in 1945. In the man's pocket was a corroded metal tag engraved with U-13X. Radiation levels around the wreck were slightly elevated, not enough to be immediately dangerous, but enough to trigger the team's Geiger counters. Samples were sealed in lead canisters and sent to the United States for analysis. Within 2 days, the entire operation was classified at the highest level, and SeaVane's mission logs were transferred to NATO archives in Brussels. The Swedish government, officially neutral, protested the sudden withdrawal of its personnel but received no explanation. Publicly, the incident was described as a misidentified geological formation. In 1960, a British intelligence officer stationed in Copenhagen, Captain James Holleran, wrote an internal memo warning that the SeaVane discovery had drawn Soviet attention. According to intercepted communications, the Soviet Navy's Baltic fleet dispatched reconnaissance trawlers to the coordinates under the guise of fishing vessels. A week later, NATO's monitoring network detected the presence of a Soviet salvage ship, the Neva, lingering over the site. The Swedes filed a diplomatic protest. Moscow denied any involvement. For 3 months, the area became the scene of a silent standoff, a theatre of divers, submarines, and espionage, played out beneath grey northern waters. The confrontation ended abruptly in November, when the Anomaly vanished from sonar. Officially, the wreck had collapsed under sediment pressure. Unofficially, NATO command received a terse telegram from its naval liaison in Stockholm. Target area empty. No trace of structure or debris. Seabed disturbed. Divers sent to confirm found only gouges in the mud where something had been dragged or lifted. Whatever the Baltic anomaly was, it was gone. 3 months later, in early 1961, Commander Delmare, who had initiated the first report, was reassigned to a desk post in Paris. He rarely spoke of SeaVane, but in a 1975 interview for a private military journal, he let slip one detail that raised eyebrows among researchers decades later. "We weren't the first to find it," he said. "The Soviets knew. They were looking for it long before we were. It wasn't theirs. It was older." In 1978, a declassified US Navy radiological analysis identified the isotopic signatures from SeaVane's recovered samples as consistent with experimental reactor shielding alloys manufactured during 1944-45. The alloys bore microscopic serial stamps linking them to the Auerwerke Company of Oranienburg, which had been involved in uranium enrichment under the Reich's atomic program. That connection reignited speculation that the object could have been part of Germany's late-war efforts to build a nuclear-powered U-boat prototype, a theory previously dismissed as implausible. If true, it would mean the Germans had tested compact reactor components in the Baltic just before the war's end. However, Later testimony from one of the Swedish divers, Erik Sundström, offered a darker interpretation. Before his death in 1992, Sundström told a journalist that beneath the hull, they had found an embossed metal plate stamped SeaVane Versuchsbasis, Abt X Kammler. The name linked the wreck directly to SS General Hans Kammler, the same architect of secret weapons projects who had disappeared after Operation Solstice. According to Sundström, his commanding officer ordered all evidence destroyed after photographing the plate. He never saw it again. In 1984, the Swedish government quietly conducted another underwater survey of the same coordinates, citing environmental research. The mission report, later leaked, noted an anomalous magnetic reading consistent with a buried ferromagnetic mass, possibly deeper under sediment. Attempts to excavate were blocked by sudden technical malfunctions, sonar interference, compass drift, and communications blackout. The survey was terminated, and all collected data was labeled unreliable. Within months, the SeaVane file disappeared from Swedish archives altogether. NATO's version of events remains heavily redacted. The 1959 to 1961 SeaVane operations are referenced in only 4 surviving documents, each ending with the notation, transferred to higher authority, Protocol 4091. The meaning of that protocol remains classified. In 1991, when German reunification opened access to former East German military records, researchers found a single entry in the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit archives, dated October 1960. Western powers conducting recovery of submerged structure identified as Special Cargo Type 9, Soviet observation ongoing. Recommend continued silence. Nothing more. Those who have pursued the SeaVane mystery describe a consistent pattern: denial, erasure, and quiet intimidation. 2 civilian sonar technicians who claim to have mapped a metallic dome at the coordinates in 1998 were later found dead in what police called a maritime accident. Their notes vanished. A 3rd technician emigrated to Canada, later stating in an interview that it wasn't a U-boat, it was a vault. Today, the coordinates east of Gotland are listed as a restricted navigation zone, justified under environmental protection. Commercial vessels are advised to avoid the area due to unexploded ordnance. Yet NATO declassified weather satellite imagery from 1971 shows faint linear disturbances along the seabed, forming a perfect ellipse, unnatural symmetry at a depth where human construction is improbable. Whether the Baltic Anomaly was an experimental craft, a storage vault for radioactive material, or something more obscure, something meant to vanish, the silence surrounding Operation SeaVane endures. Officially, no operation by that name ever took place. Unofficially, its code name still appears in NATO data transfer logs as recently as 2009, attached to a single recurring classification label: non-conventional origin, do not recover. Chapter 5. The Cold Files of Operation Eclipse, April 1945. Germany was collapsing under the combined weight of Soviet and Western offensives. Yet, amid the chaos of surrender, a different kind of operation was unfolding, one that had nothing to do with victory or occupation. Its codename, Operation Eclipse, appeared innocuous in Allied orders. Officially, it was the plan for dividing Germany into occupation zones and securing key administrative centers. But within its framework existed a parallel directive: the quiet seizure of Nazi scientific, medical, and intelligence assets before the Soviets could reach them. The mission's true scope extended far beyond the capture of factories or laboratories. It was a race to control the post-war world's most dangerous knowledge. The first Eclipse teams entered Düsseldorf, Leipzig, and Weimar days before their official sectors were established. Among them were officers from the US Counterintelligence Corps, British Scientific Intelligence, and the newly formed Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, CIOS. Their instructions were delivered verbally, never written. Identify Category Black material and remove it without record. Category Black referred to anything of extraordinary or ethically compromised scientific origin, a euphemism for research conducted through human experimentation in concentration camps. By mid-May, reports from these teams spoke of files seized from Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, and Mauthausen, notes on hypothermia endurance, altitude chamber exposure, and regenerative medicine performed on prisoners. Some of the documents bore signatures of SS medical officers later listed as missing or dead. But the materials did not go to Nuremberg for evidence. They were sent to a holding depot in Heidelberg under the custodianship of Major Henry T. Kellner, OSS liaison to US Army intelligence. From there, they were sorted, duplicated, and quietly redirected to classified US Army technical divisions. In a declassified inventory dated August 1945, Kellner listed 32 sealed crates under reference M47B Cat Black. The crates' descriptions included physiological adaptation under duress, neurochemical resilience studies, and energy transfer through high-frequency field exposure. These subjects did not appear in any post-war trial documentation. When asked decades later, Allied medical authorities claimed the data was deemed unusable. Yet in 1947, internal Pentagon correspondence referred to the same materials as under evaluation for military application. The secret was maintained through compartmentalization. Scientists deemed salvageable were relocated under Operation Paperclip, given new identities and contracts with the US Army Air Forces and private research companies. Their research, often stripped of names, appeared in technical bulletins under titles such as Post-War Biomedical Advances and Extreme Environment Physiology. What remained of their original notes was archived under a new heading created by the Defense Department in 1952, Project Morning Light. Little is known of Morning Light's internal workings, but fragments from the US Army's Fort Detrick records point to a directive for enhancement of human endurance using data recovered from German wartime experimentation. By 1953, the CIA's newly formed Technical Services Division had requested access to Morning Light materials for use in behavior modification research. The same year saw the birth of MK-Ultra. When Senate hearings decades later tried to trace the origins of MK-Ultra's physiological experiments, every path led to missing or destroyed post-war documents that perfectly matched the timing of the Eclipse seizures. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, British intelligence conducted its own version of the program. Under the codename Operation Surge, MI6 officers retrieved medical reports from the former Dachau Institute for Aviation Medicine and transferred them to Portendown. The British Air Ministry's file catalogue later showed cross-references between Surge and Eclipse entries, proof of coordinated effort. In both cases, the document's official fate was identical, destroyed due to biohazard risk. Yet the summaries survived, stripped of identifiers, rewritten as benign scientific progress. The Soviets, too, knew of Eclipse. Declassified KGB files from 1967 describe intercepted Allied dispatches referencing black lists of scientists to be captured. In one memo, a Soviet officer wrote, "Americans removing doctors from Mauthausen for work in the West. These are war criminals disguised as specialists." Soviet counterintelligence even claimed that one such individual, Dr. Friedrich H., was spotted in Washington in 1948, working at a US Army Medical Research Unit. His name never appeared in Nuremberg proceedings. The existence of Category Black remained a rumor among intelligence historians until 1976, when a congressional subcommittee requested all files relating to human experimentation between 1945 and 1955. The Pentagon responded that no records were ever created. However, an internal Department of Defense memo dated that same year surfaced decades later, revealing the opposite. It instructed archivists to move Eclipse-related biomedical files to a restricted annex in Fort Meade and relabel them under training film reels. When journalist Robert Haynes published excerpts from that memo in 1989, he was sued for possession of classified material. The case was dismissed after the document's authenticity could not be verified. In 1993, during the Clinton administration's declassification initiative, a single file labeled Operation Eclipse, Phase 3, was discovered misfiled within an Air Force photographic archive. The film reels inside contained blurred laboratory footage dated 1946-47. Men in US uniforms were seen sorting German files and sealing them in wooden crates marked with black circles. The Eclipse insignia. In one frame, the camera pans across a stack of folders, stamped, Mauthausen, Biophysical Division. Within weeks of the film's discovery, the reels were recalled by the Department of Defense, and their current location is unknown. The most haunting testimony comes from Dr. Evelyn Ward, a military archivist who handled classified medical materials in the early 1960s. Before her death in 2005, Ward privately told a historian that she'd once reviewed a document labeled Eclipse Annex 7B, Continuity Personnel. It listed approximately 40 names of scientists reintegrated under alternate identity. She recalled one entry reading, Subject 19, transferred to US Air Medical Lab, Dayton, Ohio, classified as non-German national. When asked what became of the file, she smiled and said, "You don't erase something like that. You just bury it deeper." The pattern repeats across decades: disappearance, reclassification, and denial. For every document mentioning Eclipse, 3 others are missing. For every witness, another is silenced by time or circumstance. Even within NATO's scientific archives, which inherited certain US files after the 1960 reorganization, references to Eclipse are replaced with the sterile phrase "special collection, no index." And yet, scattered across military correspondence, small cracks appear. A 1958 Air Force research memo lists data derived from Eclipse physiology files in a study on pilot endurance. A 1969 Navy report cites legacy materials from pre-1947 European field data. Each trace leads back to the same sealed foundation. The data collected in those final days of the Reich, traded for immunity and power in a world desperate to move on. Historians call it the moral blind spot of victory, the idea that truth can be negotiated if it serves stability. Operation Eclipse was not about erasing German atrocities. It was about appropriating their fruits. The official histories end with the liberation of the camps. The Eclipse files begin where liberation turned into acquisition. Today, no one can say with certainty where the cold files of Operation Eclipse rest. Some claim they were incinerated at Fort Detrick in 1973. Others believe they remain hidden in a NATO vault outside Mons, mislabeled as atmospheric testing reports. What endures are the echoes, classified medical advancements, unidentified scientists in government payrolls, and technology decades ahead of its time. Every now and then, a file number surfaces in a declassified index, like a ghostly remnant, ECLP Black 9, contents unknown. And in the margins of an old War Department memo, handwritten in faint graphite, is the phrase that outlived every witness: records were never created. What remains of the war lies not in monuments or museums, but in the sealed cabinets and erased ledgers of those who rewrote its ending. The convoys that vanished, the tunnels that hummed long after their creators were gone, the laboratories burned before surrender. They are pieces of a war that never stopped, only changed its name. As new conflicts emerged, the same shadows reappeared in different uniforms, speaking the same language of silence. Somewhere beneath the archives, behind locked NATO doors and buried code words, the story continues, unfinished, waiting. History may call it rumor, conspiracy, or myth, but every myth begins with something someone wanted forgotten.